You walked into a grocery store last week, same store, same aisle, same brand of bread, same carton of eggs, same bag of rice. And something felt off. Not dramatic, just heavier. The receipt was a few dollars longer than it was in January. You probably blamed the usual suspects: tariffs, supply chains, maybe the war in Iran driving up gas prices. But here is what nobody told you. Those few extra dollars are just the beginning. The biggest threat coming for your food budget this year is not oil. It is not gasoline. It is a white granular powder called urea that you have probably never heard of, made from a gas you cannot see, shipped through a strait most people cannot find on a map. And the price of that powder jumped 75% in just 3 weeks. Let me show you why that matters more than anything else happening in the global economy right now. Here is how the modern food system actually works. Every plant on Earth needs 3 things to grow beyond what nature alone can provide: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Of those 3, nitrogen is the bottleneck. It is the nutrient that runs out first, the one that determines how much food a single field can produce in a given season. And here is the strange part. Nitrogen is everywhere. It makes up 78% of the air you are breathing right now. But plants cannot use it in that form. It just floats there, inert, useless, surrounding every farm on Earth while crops starve for it. In 1908, a German chemist named Fritz Haber figured out how to pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into ammonia, a reactive form that plant roots can absorb. His colleague Carl Bosch then scaled that laboratory process to industrial production, the Haber-Bosch process. It sounds like a footnote in a chemistry textbook. It is arguably the single most important invention of the 20th century, and almost nobody knows what it is. Before Haber-Bosch, the planet supported 1.6 billion people. Today it supports more than 8 billion. Nearly half of the nitrogen in your body, in your muscles, your blood, your DNA, was originally pulled from the atmosphere using this one chemical reaction. Remove synthetic nitrogen fertilizer from the equation, and the Earth can feed roughly 4 billion people. The other 4 billion simply do not eat. Every second person watching this video exists because 2 German chemists figured out how to turn air into food more than a century ago. So where does the ammonia come from? Natural gas. Methane gets heated under extreme pressure in the presence of hydrogen to synthesize ammonia. Natural gas is not just one input among many. It accounts for 80% of the total production cost of nitrogen fertilizer. That number bears repeating: 80%. Wherever cheap natural gas exists in abundance, fertilizer plants follow. And the cheapest natural gas on Earth sits under the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Iran, these countries did not just build oil empires. They built fertilizer empires on top of them. 1/3 of all seaborne fertilizer trade on the planet passes through a single waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, 2 unidirectional shipping lanes. That is the entire margin between global food stability and crisis. And as of late February 2026, that waterway is effectively closed. Shipping traffic through the strait dropped more than 95%, from roughly 130 ships per day to single digits. Everyone watches the oil price. Brent crude spiked to $126 a barrel, and that made front pages in every country. But here is what did not make headlines. The region exports 22 million tons of urea every year. That flow stopped. 38% of global nitrate-based fertilizer supply went dark. 20% of phosphate-based fertilizer vanished from the market. The commodity analytics firm Kepler measured a 33% contraction in the entire global fertilizer supply chain, and all of it happened right at the start of planting season across the northern hemisphere. This is not an oil crisis, this is a food crisis, and nobody is talking about it. Think of it like a hospital emergency room. Oil is the ambulance. Everyone sees it racing down the street. Everyone tracks it on the news. Politicians hold press conferences about fuel prices every week. Fertilizer is the blood supply inside the hospital, invisible to anyone who is not a doctor, taken completely for granted, until it stops flowing. And when the blood supply dries up, the patient does not collapse in the waiting room where cameras can film it. The damage is internal. It takes weeks, sometimes months. By the time you see the symptoms, the crisis is already far advanced. That is exactly what is happening inside the global food system right now. You just cannot see it on your grocery receipt yet. Here is where the chain breaks first, at your kitchen table. 54 American agricultural groups wrote a joint letter to President Trump in March, demanding urgent market relief for the nation's farmers. That letter was not polite lobbying. It was a warning. Planting season started across the United States at the exact moment the strait shut down, and the farmers who grow the food you eat are now facing an impossible set of calculations that will determine what you pay at the supermarket in September. Here is why. Corn requires significantly more nitrogen fertilizer per acre than soybeans do. American urea prices jumped 28% in just 3 weeks after the strait closed. If fertilizer costs too much, farmers shift acres away from corn and toward soybeans, because soybeans fix some of their own nitrogen from the atmosphere and need less purchased input. That sounds like a clever adaptation. It is not. It is a trap. Less corn planted in April means less corn harvested in October. Less corn harvested means higher feed prices for livestock through the winter. Higher feed prices translate directly into more expensive beef, chicken, dairy products, and eggs at the store next spring. The planting decisions being made right now in fields across Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Kansas will show up on your grocery receipt 6 months from now. You might think the United States is insulated from a crisis in the Persian Gulf. After all, America produces roughly 75% of the fertilizer it consumes domestically, thanks to abundant natural gas. That number sounds comfortable. Here's what it hides. Fertilizer is a globally traded commodity. When urea prices spike in Cairo and Sao Paulo, domestic prices in Des Moines follow, regardless of where the product was actually manufactured. And the exposure runs deeper than nitrogen alone. The United States has grown increasingly dependent on Saudi Arabian phosphate fertilizers, specifically DAP and MAP, after countervailing duties blocked cheaper Moroccan and Russian supply, and China suspended its phosphate exports entirely. A former chief economist at the United States Department of Agriculture described the situation to Fortune magazine in plain language, saying margins are very poor and a bad decision this year could be pretty costly. The safety net under American agriculture is thinner than most people realize, but this crisis does not stop at the American border. And the second place it hits hardest is the country that feeds more of the world than almost any other. Brazil imports 85% of all the fertilizer it uses, 85%. The country is the largest fertilizer importer on the planet by volume, bringing in 45.5 million tons in 2025 alone, worth roughly $15 billion. And Brazil is not some marginal agricultural economy. It is the single largest soybean exporter on Earth, shipping roughly 60% of the world's traded soybeans. Its current harvest is projected at a record 6.5 billion bushels, and nearly 80% of those beans go to one buyer: China. If Brazil cannot deliver, China comes shopping in the American market instead, bidding up the same soybeans that feed livestock right here in the United States and driving your feed costs, your meat prices, and your grocery bill higher in the process. So follow the chain. Natural gas from the Gulf makes ammonia. Ammonia makes urea. Urea ships across the Atlantic to Brazilian ports. Brazilian farmers spread it across 120 million acres of cropland. Those fields produce soybeans. Soybeans cross the Pacific to feed livestock in China, poultry in Europe, and cattle operations right here in the United States. Break any single link in that chain and the entire system buckles. The link just broke. Brazilian soybean production costs nearly doubled between 2020 and 2024, from $172 per ton to $337 per ton, driven largely by fertilizer shocks. Now stack another price spike on top of margins that were already razor thin, and the pattern does not end with Brazil. It repeats across every major agricultural region on Earth with the same structure and the same result every single time. India depends on Qatari liquefied natural gas to power its domestic urea production plants. That gas transits the Strait of Hormuz. India is now issuing emergency urea import tenders, scrambling for supply from anywhere that is not the Gulf. Asia as a whole receives 35% of the world's traded urea, 53% of its sulfur, and 64% of its ammonia from Gulf producers. All of it is now constrained or completely cut off. China saw this crisis developing and slammed the door shut. Beijing imposed quota limits on bulk fertilizer exports to protect its domestic food supply. That decision removed the largest alternative nitrogen source from global trade at the exact moment every other agricultural nation on the planet needed it most. Chinese nitrogen had been the primary supply source for Southern Hemisphere farmers. That door is now closed. Indonesia, the world's largest palm oil producer, depends on Gulf origin fertilizer for its plantation operations. Supply disrupted, production costs climbing fast. Pakistan, already struggling with severe food insecurity, formally requested Saudi Arabia reroute fertilizer through the Red Sea port of Yanbu. But the bypass pipeline was built for crude oil, not ammonia. There is no alternative route for fertilizer because nobody ever built one. Sub-Saharan Africa, the most vulnerable region on Earth to food price shocks, imports the vast majority of its nitrogen fertilizer from global markets that are now in crisis. A senior United Nations trade official warned that the least developed economies will feel the effects most strongly. For families already spending 60 to 70% of their income on food, even a modest price increase is not an inconvenience. It is a catastrophe with no margin for error. Vietnam, a major rice exporter, faces potential production shortfalls later this year if fertilizer supply remains constrained through the summer. 7 countries, 5 continents, 1 choke point, same story every time, and nobody is talking about it. Before I give you my conclusion, here is the strongest counter-argument, and here is why it collapses under scrutiny. You might be thinking we have survived this kind of shock before. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, fertilizer prices spiked, the world adjusted, and everything turned out fine. That reasoning sounds perfectly logical on the surface. It is dead wrong, and here is exactly why. In 2022, urea prices surged roughly 40% over the first month or two after the invasion. DAP and MAP jumped more than 30%. Potash climbed about 19%. The current crisis produced a 28% spike in nitrogen prices in just 3 weeks. Faster, more concentrated, and aimed directly at the single most critical category of agricultural input on the planet. But speed is not even the real difference. In 2022, the Strait of Hormuz was open. Ships moved freely through the Persian Gulf. The disruption came from sanctions and logistics in the Black Sea region, thousands of kilometers away from the world's nitrogen production centers. Gulf states kept producing, kept exporting. Every ammonia plant in Qatar and Saudi Arabia ran at full capacity throughout that entire conflict. This time, the production itself is shutting down. Iraq and Kuwait have already curtailed oil and gas output because they have nowhere to store it and no way to ship it. When hydrocarbon production stops, sulfur production stops alongside it, because sulfur is a byproduct of oil and gas refining. And sulfur is an essential plant nutrient that fertilizer producers everywhere else need as a raw material. So, this shock does not just block fertilizer shipments from leaving the Gulf. It actively destroys the raw inputs that factories in India, Brazil, Europe, and North America need to manufacture fertilizer on their own soil. That is a fundamentally different kind of crisis than anything the world faced in 2022. Researchers at the University of Illinois compared the two events side by side. The 2022 shock hit grain markets harder initially because Russia and Ukraine together control roughly 29% of global wheat exports. The 2026 shock is hammering fertilizer production harder because the Persian Gulf is not a transit corridor. It is the manufacturing center itself. That distinction will define what happens to food prices over the next 12 months. Let me show you the math on what comes next. If global agricultural yields decline by even 5% because of reduced fertilizer application, that does not translate into a neat 5% increase at the checkout counter. Agricultural commodities trade on razor-thin margins between supply and demand globally. A 5% drop in production can trigger a 20 to 30% price increase because buyers compete aggressively for a shrinking pool of available supply. 5 divided by a thin margin does not equal 5. It equals something far worse. That is not speculation or modeling. It is exactly what happened to wheat in 2022 and to rice during the 2008 global food crisis. And here is the part that should alarm you more than any other fact in this entire video. After the strait closed, the International Energy Agency coordinated the release of 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves across its member countries. 400 million barrels. That is the standard emergency playbook, written after the 1973 oil embargo taught governments the hard way that energy supply needs a buffer. They learned the lesson. They built the buffer. There is no equivalent for fertilizer, not a single ton held in reserve anywhere on the planet. No G7 country maintains a strategic fertilizer stockpile. Not the United States, not Japan, not Germany, not France, not Britain, not Canada, not Italy. The system that feeds roughly half of the 8 billion people alive today has no emergency backup, no buffer. No second option. Oil gets stockpiles, naval escorts, bypass pipelines, diplomatic summits, and presidential press conferences. Fertilizer gets nothing. A ship captain Daring enough to run the strait under active drone fire will carry crude oil, not urea, because oil pays more per ton of cargo, and every financial incentive in the system points that direction. A naval escort mission will protect energy tankers before bulk fertilizer carriers every single time, because that is how governments and militaries rank priorities. The Saudi East-West pipeline that bypasses the strait carries crude oil to the Red Sea. No equivalent bypass exists for ammonia or urea products, and nobody is building one. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put the logic plainly. Because fertilizer has less value than oil and gas, political and business leaders expend fewer resources to make sure it keeps flowing. That sentence is a policy confession, and you are going to pay for it at the grocery store. Not this month, but by fall and every week after that, for as long as this system stays broken. This is not an oil crisis. This is a food crisis. So what do you actually do with this information? Here are 5 numbers you should be watching starting today. Think of them as your personal early warning dashboard for food prices. When these numbers cross certain thresholds, your grocery bill follows with a 3 to 6 month delay. First, the urea spot price. Before the crisis, FOB Egyptian granular urea traded between $400 and $490 per metric ton. It jumped to roughly $700 in the first 3 weeks. Fitch Ratings raised its 2026 ammonia and urea price forecasts by 25%. If the spot price crosses $800 and stays there for more than 2 weeks, expect a significant pass-through into corn and wheat costs within 1 growing season. This is the single most reliable leading indicator for food inflation that almost nobody outside the agricultural commodities industry tracks. Second, Brent crude oil price. Not because of gasoline, but because of what it signals for natural gas and fertilizer production costs. In most long-term supply contracts outside North America, natural gas prices are indexed to oil. When Brent approaches or crosses $100 per barrel for a sustained period, nitrogen fertilizer production costs climb sharply across Europe, South America, and Southeast Asia. The threshold to watch is sustained pricing above $95 for 30 consecutive days or more, because that is the level where fertilizer producers begin passing costs through to buyers. Third, the corn to soybean price ratio in Chicago futures. When nitrogen fertilizer gets expensive, American farmers pivot acres from corn to soybeans. If this ratio drops below 2.3, the market is pricing in a major planting shift. That shift means less corn in the fall, higher animal feed costs through the winter, and more expensive meat, dairy, and eggs at retail by spring. Watch this number weekly. Fourth, the national average gasoline price. Before the conflict, it stood at $2.81 per gallon in early January. By mid-March, it reached $3.88. If it crosses $4.50 and holds at that level, the combined weight of higher fuel, transportation, and fertilizer costs will push annualized food-at-home inflation above 5%. A threshold the country has not crossed since 2022, and one that changes how families spend money across every category. Fifth, the monthly Food-at-Home Consumer Price Index published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In February 2026, it registered a 2.4% year-over-year increase. That measurement was calculated using data collected before the fertilizer shock reaches the food chain. Watch for a jump above 4% in the months ahead. When that line breaks, the Federal Reserve faces a direct collision between fighting inflation and supporting a weakening labor market. That collision is when consequences stop being theoretical and start showing up in mortgage rates, credit card terms, and hiring freezes that affect every household in the country. Track these 5 numbers, and you are not guessing about the future. You are reading the signals in real time, months ahead of the headlines. Energy, fertilizer, planting decisions, fuel costs, and consumer prices are not 5 stories in 5 different worlds. They are one chain with 5 links. Pull any single one and the rest move with it. Here is where this all comes back to you. That grocery receipt from last week, those few extra dollars you shrugged off as just another bad month, by October, they will look like a rounding error compared to what is coming. Because the real shock is still moving through the system right now, working its way from ports to farms to feedlots to processing plants, and it has not reached your checkout counter yet. March is already gone. That purchasing window closed without the fertilizer arriving. The question now is April. If the strait reopens in the first week of April, some damage can still be limited. Farmers pay more, but they get supply in time. The system bends but holds. But if the closure extends through the end of April, planting decisions across the northern hemisphere lock in permanently for this growing season. Fertilizer that was not purchased this spring cannot be applied retroactively in July. Yields drop. And the price increases that follow will not appear on your receipt for 3 to 6 months, long after the news cycle has moved on to something else entirely, long after you have stopped thinking about a choke point you never knew existed. This is not an oil crisis, this is a food crisis, and now you know what is coming. The invention that made it possible to feed 8 billion people runs on one resource, through one choke point, with zero backup. And right now, 1/3 of that system has gone dark. There are two kinds of people watching this economy right now. Those who understand that energy and food are a single system connected by one chemical reaction running through one choke point. And those who will spend the next 12 months wondering why everything at the store keeps getting more expensive without ever understanding why. If this changed how you see what is on your plate, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me which of those 5 dashboard numbers you plan to start tracking this week. And send this video to someone who still believes this crisis is only about the price of gasoline. Because it is not, and now you know why.